Today I'm going to be changing out my peep sight. I just got back from TAC, Michigan, and I went to a much smaller peep sight than honestly what I wanted to for those events. A smaller peep sight is going to focus your rear sight and your front sight orientation. So the smaller that peep sight, the more it focuses you to be perfectly center when it comes to what you see for that front sight picture and looking through your rear peephole. Now, one of the things that I've talked about in the past for improving your accuracy is going to a smaller peep, but also a little bit smaller front sight for these types of events where you're shooting at longer distances and you're wanting to be more accurate at those longer distances. But this raises another really important topic, which is what exactly do I look for when it comes to peep orientation or rear sight, front sight, or front sight, rear sight picture? And a great question that's been brought up several times is how do we address that if we don't have a perfectly round front sight versus the rear sight? So let me just talk with you about this quickly, and I'm going to walk you through my process for front sight, rear sight acquisition / orientation, okay? So first off, what you want to have is you want to have a peep sight that gives you a perfect eclipse around your sight picture. So if you're shooting a 2-pin sight, you're going to have a slightly smaller scope. You're going to be able to have probably a slightly smaller peep sight and still be able to fit all that in. Now, if you have an oblong sight, this is where things get weird because you've got an oval and a circle. So the question is, what is the orientation? Okay, well, there's a couple things here. Keep in mind your peep is a full circle, and as long as those pins are perfectly oriented in the exact same place all the time, whether you're shooting uphill or downhill, as long as those pins are always in the exact position within that rear sight, then you're going to have accuracy and consistency. So when it comes to front sight, rear sight acquisition, when I draw back and I look through my peep and I'm looking at my sight pin, I go through a peep check. Okay, now this could be done honestly one of two ways. An easy way for me to tell you to do it right now, based on the fact that some of you may have an oval, this is going to help you. So it's 6 to 9 to pin to bubble, 6 to 9. So when I say that, here's what happens once I'm drawn back, anchored, I adjust my head, I'm looking through my peep sight, and I've moved my pin onto the target, and the pin's on the target, and now I'm going to check that front sight, rear sight orientation. So what I do is I check in at 6 o'clock first. I check in right here. So if one time I have the bottom of my peep right against the bottom edge of the scope housing, that could give me one high and low distance, whereas if the next time, if I've nudge that up to where I'm covering part of that bubble, well, honestly, doing this is no different than moving that pin down, which would make me hit high. So making sure that at 6 o'clock, I have a perfect touch right there. Now, for me personally, I actually touch it up right to the bottom edge of my bubble where the white of my ring matches the bottom of that yellow bubble. So I've got that dark black line, which is my peep, and I check in right there at 6 o'clock. Next thing I do is I go right over to 9 o'clock. So my focus goes from 6 to 9, and I check in over here. So do I have spacing? Do I have spacing out here, or am I blocking this off? So if I've got spacing out here, well, that's no different than moving my pin to the right. I'm going to end up hitting and have to make adjustments if I'm not checking that. So check in at 6, check in at 9, same thing. I make sure the left edge, the 9 o'clock edge of my peep sight is perfectly butting up to the 9 o'clock edge of that housing. Now this is going to be critical down here for an oblong scope or an oblong front sight picture. So in this case, what I would tell you is wherever you check in at your 6 o'clock, you need to make sure that all those other pins can perfectly fit within your peep sight. Okay, so for some people, depending on where their 20 is, they might actually have to check in very close to the bottom edge of that bubble, or maybe right at the bottom part of the swoop of your bubble in order to be able to see those upper pins. And you want to make sure you can see them all. You want to have a front sight, rear sight, perfect circle in the perfect place every time, or it's really no different than moving your sight around. Your lefts and your rights and your highs and lows are going to be all over the place. So check in at 6, check in at 9, then I go to my pin. So in this case, up here on my sight, I would check in here. I'd make sure I'm bumped up, the bottom black part of my peep is bumped up to the bottom edge of that bubble, right where I can barely start to see a little bit of white. Then I check in over here, I make sure there's no daylight on the outside of my scope, and I also make sure I'm not covering that white circle that is the ring of my front sight. So I check in here, then I go to my pin. Okay, and what's nice about this system is you're using 25% of the whole picture, but since it's a circle, if you're utilizing 25% of that pie, then the rest of the pie is all going to fall into perfect orientation. So 6, 9, I get to my pin. I make sure my pin's on target, okay? If by chance you have to move your pin a long way, there's a good chance your tilt and your lean could slightly get screwed up too during that process. So that's why I go from 6 to 9 to my pin. Make sure my pin's on target. Pin's on target, it's critical you check your bubble. So then my sight goes right down to my bubble, make sure my bubble's level. Then while my vision is already down there, I'll check in one more time at my 6 o'clock, quick glance at 9 o'clock. If the sight picture is perfect, I go back to the pin and I start going through that shot process of pulling on that trigger and allowing that float to happen. But I've double confirmed my peep orientation twice by going 6, 9, pin, bubble, 6, 9, pin. That way, you know without a shadow of a doubt that orientation is absolutely perfect. Think of it like this. For every millimeter or 2 millimeters that you are off in regards to the front sight, rear sight orientation, that's really no different than looking at your sight scale and seeing what 1 yard, 2 yards, 3 yards is. So imagine you've got 3 to 4 millimeters of daylight underneath that housing because you weren't paying attention. Well, that's no different than moving that sight pin up 3 to 4 yards. So you're going to be off simply because your front sight, rear sight orientation was not correct. So regardless of whether you have a perfect round circle or whether you have an oval like this or an oblong shaped sight, there's lots of different ones out there. Some sights, the inside of this housing is blocked off, which is why the outside, the 9 o'clock, is normally always available for you to see. 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock, pin, bubble, 6, 9, pin, okay? That'd be a perfect case for this sight because otherwise half of your inside of this sight is blocked. So if you did 6, 3, pin, bubble, it would be really hard because this block would be in the way. On some of the new Picatinny sights that have a direct front mount system, same thing applied. Sometimes you can't see the inside of that scope because everything's moved over so much. This is a very old sight that I shot, one of the very first Sherlocks, probably 30 years old, one of the early prototypes. This wasn't a perfectly round housing. Now the pins are perfectly center, but I always had to check in at 6, check in at 9, go to my pins, go to my bubble, 6, 9, back to my pin, go through my shot, okay? So regardless of whether you have the circle or an oblong shape, depending on what you have, just recognize the fact that I want you to check in at 25% of that pie and the rest should perfectly fall into place. This is such a critical component to long range accuracy, short range too. The further you are, the more these mistakes will be magnified. So remember that for peep orientation, front sight, rear sight, checking in. Check in at the bottom, check in at the side, pin, bubble, bottom, side, back to your pin, on target, trust the float, pull through the shot. Now I've got to change out this peep so that it's just a little bit bigger This was all I had. It was a little bit too small. I'm gonna go a little bit bigger so that I can perfectly just barely see that white. And I'm gonna be on pace for long bombs at the TAC this weekend.